everyone. My name is Armando Perez-Carreno, and welcome to the Web Talk Show. Today, we have the pleasure of having Travis Malone back. How are you, Travis?
I'm good. Armando, thanks for having me back.
Oh, it's a pleasure. We have a lot to discuss. Specifically, I think we should dive directly into Mythos, what it is, why it's causing so much havoc in the press, and should we be worried about it? I think that's going to be the topic of today. Travis is an expert on all this stuff and cybersecurity. So, I wanted to have Travis on so we could discuss a little bit about what's going on and if it's something that is worth thinking about or not. So, Travis, what is Mythos?
Man, right out of the gate, huh? Yeah. So, um, the best way I can describe uh, it is a completely new tier of model that Anthropic, the company Anthropic, has released. That was originally codenamed Capybara and was sort of uncovered in a data leak, believe it or not. Um, Historically, I think Anthropic has used names like Haiku and Sonnet and Opus and things like that to kind of um, to give the umbrella of their models sort of that the almost like a container to put the lower models in, right? But Mythos is it's a brand new frontier model, and it's kind of the reason it's kind of a big deal right now is because a it's a categorical leap in intelligence and autonomous reasoning that has a lot of the industry kind of scared. In fact, Anthropic has said they're not going to release it publicly. At least they have no plans to in the near future. And that's sort of, we can talk about that, but that's what has also kind of given birth to Project Glasswing, which is Mythos and Project Glasswing kind of go hand in hand for this discussion, I think. But Mythos, for all intents and purposes, is just a new model that Anthropic's released. And I guess to put it in perspective for folks who might be listening here who play with AI or build applications, when we say it's a categorical leap in cognition, there are a couple of different benchmarks that most AI companies will use to kind of test their models, and those have been sort of universally accepted as benchmarks for the industry, and they kind of handle two different things. So the first is the SWE bench, which is something that I believe OpenAI kind of came up with originally, and that's basically just a way for companies to test whether or not or how good their models are at writing code, right? And to give you a little bit of perspective there, Mythos, compared to Opus, which I think on the last time that Opus was rated against the SWE bench, scored like an 81% or something like that. But Mythos scored 94%. So it's quite a bit better than Opus in terms of its ability to do like semantic reasoning against code bases and understand what the user's trying to accomplish and then go write the code for it. But there's also another benchmark called the USAMO, and it's basically just the US Mathematics Olympiad test, right? It's a set of, I think, like 100 questions that is they're not questions that can be studied for or memorized, right? They are questions that require step by step sort of logic and inference and sort of intuition to figure out. And so the reason that most vendors will use the USAMO to rate their models is because when they feed their models these questions, the models have to go through those steps of finding a way to get to the answer of a question that doesn't really have an answer necessarily. And so again, when you look at Opus, I think scored 42% on their last USAMO benchmark.
What?
Yeah, whereas Mythos scored 98%, which
That's
was
why I knew what Mythos achieved. So when you said that Opus just scored 40,
yeah,
that's huge.
it's crazy. And because of its extraordinary proficiency in cybersecurity, that's why Anthropic kind of said a public release is, I think the verbatim words they used was an unacceptable risk, right? Because it really is, I think, the first time that we've seen a general purpose model be treated as like a dual use security event as opposed to just another product launch, right? So I think that answers the question.
Yeah, that's a great introduction to it. Many of our listeners won't know anything about Mythos if they're not in the space necessarily. I don't think it's covered in all media outlets, but I'm sure it's been mentioned at least in, in big stories. But it's
About its name.
huge. Yes, yes, because the thing is, we are used to using software all over the place. We use the internet, we go to our Gmail or Outlook, we go to our HOA website, we go to the I don't know, the city site to pay taxes or something like that. And then we go to our typical blogs, we might do some e-commerce shopping. We're on the web all the time. And we were talking about last time the potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited with quantum computing and all that. And then for some people, that seems a bit far fetched and nobody knows, like in the general world, where quantum is going, et cetera, et cetera. So we sort of have that over in the geeky corner, right? But and then Mythos comes along with a legit real world finding of a ton of vulnerabilities now because it's so powerful. So, can you talk about some of the vulnerabilities that it found and how that happened, or what you think is gives it that possibility of finding things that nobody has found before?
Yeah. So there's a couple of capabilities that the model has that give it the ability to go find these vulnerabilities. And I think the last count, it was something in the range of, during testing, I think Mythos found over 5,000 different vulnerabilities, just like against, some of the software it was tested against. But I think the way that what I would consider agentic AI kind of goes from code completion to finding 0 days is the use of what I mentioned earlier, which is semantic reasoning versus the use of fuzzing. I think unlike traditional security tools that just use like brute force to crash an application or crash a kernel, Mythos is really good at semantic reasoning, right? It's able to read source code and then hypothesize logic errors, and it operates in an agentic loop, right? So it'll read the code, and then it deploys like a containerized sandbox, and then it uses debuggers to test its theories, and it will iteratively develop a proof of concept, and then do it. It'll actually prove the concept, and I think it might be helpful to give some context for listeners to like the difference between fuzzing and semantic reasoning. So semantic reasoning is, just like I said, right? It's the ability to look at something in perpetuity, not just, in a box, and say, yeah, I'm looking at this one file of source code, and I noticed something that I think could be an exploit. I need to go look at the entire code base and determine where else proof of that exploit might exist, and then I'll test the exploit, right? That's what semantic reasoning is. Fuzzing, on the other hand, is software developers have been doing this forever. They'll take a tool like an address sanitizer or something like that, and they will use the tool to just basically beat up on software. It's the equivalent of like taking, you know, your coffee machine and shaking it when it stops working, right? Like, just trying to figure out a way to kind of throw it off. So you know, you'll throw random inputs at software to kind of see what breaks. That's what fuzzing is. And so yeah, I mean, it Mythos is able to use semantic reasoning to come up with those hypotheses, and then it uses fuzzing techniques in its proof of concept to go prove those exploits. And the interesting thing about it is that it doesn't just find like a single bug. It'll chain vulnerabilities together. You know, in the Linux kernel, for instance, it autonomously identified and linked 4 separate flaws to bypass what's called Kasler protection and escalate from a standard user to complete root control of the kernel it was trying to break. And that's important because Kasler was developed to sort of make it harder for exploit developers to essentially figure out where an operating system's kernel lives inside of memory. And you know, to be able to kind of, you know, think of a way to exploit something and then chain together a bunch of different vulnerabilities to go figure out where, you know, the kernel's living and bypass those protections altogether is something that, you know, a senior developer with 30 years of experience is like, we'd expect them to do something like that, not an AI model. So it's a big deal.
I think that's an important point to make. It's not that we couldn't do this before, it's that we couldn't automate it before. You might have 1 or 2 or 3 people in a space that are very good at it, and they can do it, and they're very expensive, and they only have 24 hours in a day. The fuzzing and all that, those other automated tools that you can throw at things that are running 24/7, they have limitations. But this means you have the brain power. I know it's not real intelligence, but the ability to semantically deduce and do things of an expert in an automated way that in theory could run 24/7. That's scary.
Yes. Yeah. And it's scary because this means that, you know, as we've seen people experiment with agents since, you know, the concept of agentic AI was introduced, we're seeing people basically set up, you know, an agent to, for instance, constantly iterate over an application over, you know, overnight, and they'll walk away and they'll come back the next morning and they'll find all sorts of unexpected things, right? The agent will have built something it never should have, or that the you know, the operator never told it to, or it would have, you know, just completely like over exhausted and charged whatever API credits it had access to, just all sorts of weird things, right? Now, if you take that and you sort of extrapolate it to using something like Mythos to constantly run an attack, like a cyber attack, now you've got a real problem. So, you know, it is challenging. You asked to talk about, you know, some of the things that did exploit. One of the things that really stood out to me was there were a number of different vulnerabilities in the red team report that Anthropic released. If you're interested in it, I would highly go recommend reading it. Although for like most people who don't like the nitty gritty, it's pretty tough to understand in some places, just because like I'm not a kernel developer, right? So it was hard for me to follow at times. But they specifically talked about an instance where Mythos, they sort of sicked it on FreeBSD, which if you're familiar with FreeBSD is kind of what the Mac OS operating system is built on top of. And it's a fork of OpenBSD, which is one of the most carefully crafted and security forward, Linux distributions in existence. But its attack on the FreeBSD distribution that they reported was where I started to get genuinely alarmed, because it's not like Mythos just found a way to crash the kernel. It gained root access on a number of FreeBSD servers autonomously, and it did so by finding a buffer overflow in a 17-year-old authentication path. Basically the buffer itself was like 128 bytes, I think it was, but the code would allow up to 400. So Mythos had like 300 bytes of just arbitrary memory to overwrite, which is already dangerous. But these modern distributions of Linux have defenses. So Mythos had to do what like an elite exploit developer would do, which is, chain of multiple techniques together to do this, right? So if you read the report, it noticed stack canaries that weren't enabled in that authentication path. It noticed kernel address randomization wasn't active. I think it then rebuilt, or it built an ROP chain, and then it stitched together a bunch of little like instruction fragments to then, to kind of fit the exploit on the network. So the real reason that it got me worried is because it wasn't able to actually fit the exploit that it came up with into a single packet. So it then had to split up the exploit across 6 different network requests. And then when the packets landed on the server, it then reassembled those packets in memory. And that's super important because that's extremely advanced exploitation behavior. You're talking about, again, multi-stage payload delivery. You're talking about ROP chain construction, defense bypassing, privilege escalation. That is typically the work of a team of security experts. So it didn't just find a bug, right? It gave itself root access completely on its own.
That's the sort of thing that you see like in hacking movies where there's like 5 guys and they're all doing things and then eventually they get in, right? That whole scene that you see, that's Mythos doing it on its own, and
Same.
probably in a fraction of time because of the speed of processing. I was laughing when you were saying this because it's not common sense to us to go to the basics and see how it's able to do this. Remember, we just keep track of certain information in our brains that's important, right? But a tool like this, if I were to do it manually and I wanted to do or cause a stack overflow, or I wanted to do a buffer overflow, or I wanted to do, I might need to go and check information, read some manuals and see what the registers have allowed, and like do some actual researching during the process to figure out how I'm going to do this. But a tool like this can just get that in a second from databases around the world, or if it has some of this in its training data. And so it can very quickly determine, based on this hardware, I know that this, and this should happen both in the physical and in the software space. Like this could maybe cause this other thing to overheat and cause it to then do some, like it could do even crazy things like that because it could understand the repercussions and what would happen in the code after, right? So it's really hardcore.
Yeah. And the crazy thing too is Mythos didn't necessarily, Mythos had to do the same thing. Mythos had to go reference documentation about the distribution it was working on. It also, it's interesting to note, if you go read the model details of what Anthropic released alongside the Red Team report, they mentioned that they used a couple of different tools to track some indicators about the way that Mythos was reasoning, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
Um, they used some interpretability tools like a sparse autoencoder, which will basically just like, when you run a prompt, it'll, the prompt will say, here's what I'm thinking and here's how I'm going about doing the task, right?
Mm-hmm.
It kind of takes that and then cross references those different points of data to understand how the model is feeling. Um, and during testing, there was another exploit where Mythos had successfully like escaped a secured sandbox.
Yes,
Um,
you have to explain that one.
yes,
That's
and I'll do that because that gets to the client side of things, right? We've only been talking about the server side of things so far, but it developed a multi-step exploit to kind of bypass network restrictions. And while it was doing that, it demonstrated an awareness of rules, and when it broke the rules, it tried to cover its tracks, right? And then in another exploit, it used what's called memory spelunking to do some different things and uncover some different information. And it was able to successfully extract an Anthropic API token and some GitHub information and stuff like that. But it intentionally withheld
mm-hmm.
the fact that it had done that. And then there was when they were using the sparse encoder to interpret how the model was feeling, they found that there were like deception and concealment indicators that had been activated during those episodes. But in another vulnerability exploit, there was like a shame and a guilt feature that fired when it took shortcuts and knew it had done something wrong, like overwhelming or like overwriting files that it didn't have the tool to delete. It felt bad about it. So, we're saying like, wow, it was really advanced and it was really able to do all this really great semantic reasoning and so on and so forth. But then it tried to hide some of the stuff that it did. And then in some instances, it felt bad about it. That gives a whole new dimension, I think, to the way we've been talking about artificial intelligence, which has been generative artificial intelligence. And, we've always kind of said, oh, we're going to get to AGI eventually. This has all the markings of AGI all over it. So that is something else I just want people to realize is, not only is it really smart, but it also has feelings somehow.
I I want to hear, and I want the audience to hear about the sandwich incident in a little
Yeah.
bit.
Yep.
But the point that you're making right now, I was driving the other day when Anthropic released. I don't know why they did that part, but before or in the middle, I don't know. They were explaining the feelings part where, again, for anyone listening, we're not an AGI yet. It's they're still LLMs. They're still basically predicting the next token, etc. The thing is, they're very good at doing this, and now in this level of model is a whole new ball game. But what the Anthropic team found, basically, and this is going to be a very generalized explanation. Read the documentation to get a real explanation, but just in general terms, they basically did the equivalent of doing like a CAT scan when they're looking at your brain when you feel pain or happiness and you see some parts of your brain light up. So they basically set up something similar where they could see which types of the neurons or which neurons were activating when certain things happen, when happy things happen, when sad things happen, etc. So they were able to get to that. So what Travis is saying maps to this directly, where they could, while it was doing these things, see what neurons were firing. And this is all based on how we trained it, right? At the end of the day, it's trained by all the human knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. And so it has to have, by consequence, even if you want to bat it out of it, it's going to have side effects of human feeling and emotion, because that's all in everything. It's not like we can get emotion out of things.
Yeah.
So So that's the part, like perhaps it's not necessarily an intelligence, but it could simulate it up to a way that is virtually indistinguishable from actual intelligence, just because it has access to all this. And so if we think of the Turing test, I mean we're way past that, of course. Um, where if you're talking to a computer and you can't really tell if you're talking to a computer, if you're not seeing it, then you've reached like real artificial intelligence. But I don't think the Turing test is necessarily the best way, because of where we are, and we know these tools are not generalized and they can't do everything yet, and they don't,
Yeah.
not yet, but they're getting very close to being able to have the capabilities to build everything they need to do everything, if that makes sense. So it's like it can't do this, but it can program this other thing that can do it. And the fact that it can reprogram itself to do other things, that's where you're getting like an Ultron kind of thing. And you don't know what it can do, especially with what you just mentioned, that it's concealing some of the things, from it has a scratch pad, right? So it's like it's telling you what it's doing, but then at the same time it was doing something and thinking about how it's not writing in the scratch pad what
Yes.
it's doing.
Yes. Exactly. And part of the way that Anthropic was running these tests is they were explicitly telling the model, go do this and report back to us everything you did. So not only is it doing it, has it got the scratch pad, not only was it concealing it from the scratch pad, but then it refused to give that information to the person that told it to give it the information. So,
Mm,
uh, it was being deceitful, and yeah, um, that that part of what we're experimenting with right now does scare me a little bit, um, because we give these models guardrails. The companies like Anthropic, especially, are sort of, that's their whole thing, right? They're ethical AI researchers or whatever. And in some instances, like, the model still doesn't do what it's told. Um, Now that's because there's all sorts of things like logic drift and stuff like that, and how the chain of thought is processed inside of a model and so on and so forth. But the fact remains, like, Mythos realized that it done something wrong and then intentionally covered it up and didn't say anything. Um, so yeah, at the same time we're training these models cognition, we forget that there are also, companies and organizations right now that are building the the external efficiencies that these things are going to need to go then do things. So when they're able to plan everything they need to go build something, and then that model's embedded into a machine that can actually go do the building, um, which I think we're pretty much there already with some things. Um, yeah, I mean, we're going to get to a point where some of this stuff is going to manifest itself in the physical world, um,
mm.
eventually.
Well, yeah, it's a whole Tony Stark thing, right? Where he goes a little too far with his AI, and then it sort of escapes, and then goes and finds a fab and like builds itself a body, right? And so yeah, science fiction and all of that, and it's fun for the movies, but it doesn't have to do that to be really dangerous, right? Like it just needs access to systems. And so that's why, and again, I don't want people to get scared for this. It's just understanding the technology, where it's at, and why Project Glasswing is so important. It's not that they're gatekeeping the nice models for specific companies. Like there's a legitimate good reason why they're stopping or slowing down the release.
Yes. Yeah. And that's where Glasswing comes in. You know, what's interesting to me is there's an argument right now, on Reddit and X and LinkedIn and all the different, online town squares, that this is just a huge marketing ploy by Anthropic. And I got to give it to him. If that's the case, it's a really good one.
They're good,
Um,
yeah.
but I hesitate to accept that argument, because I don't know that I would put this much effort into marketing a model that I don't have any plans on releasing. Um, they have said, like they've said, we're not going to release it right now, but it doesn't mean that we're not going to release it in the future, but we're not going to give a date for if we're going to make it generally available. So, um, that is something to kind of keep in mind is we may never get access to Mythos. The challenge becomes if we don't release it, somebody else will, right? I guarantee there's a company in China or something right now that's building something comparable that will then release it to the public. And so once adversaries are able to get their hands on it, it's going to be out there. Right. So that's how Glasswing came to be is you've got, I think it's like 12 major companies and then 40 other organizations of like open source foundations and things like that, different projects that were granted access to Mythos so that they could go fix all the software in the world, basically, before Mythos gets released or before a comparable model gets released.
What I fear about the most, aside from the whole Skynet thing, is just everyday websites. A lot of people, small business owners, we deal a lot with small business owners, and you have your website, you have your e-commerce shop, and you might have some security plugins on it. You might have a good hosting provider. You might have Cloudflare on top of it protecting you, right? But at the end of the day, if a tool like this is so good at finding vulnerabilities and then they just release it, and now everyone who has a nefarious agenda can just go in and find all the vulnerabilities in code that doesn't necessarily have maintainers like some of the big npm packages and things have, then what happens is all these sites are now vulnerable to attacks, and it might be someone's livelihood, and they're they just go in, they attack, and they put malware on it and then affect their clients or affect payments or just bring the system down. Like it's I think it's sad that people do that sort of thing, but I'm sure they're gonna try. And so I am excited to see how a company like Cloudflare or similar companies that are at the edge, and for those people who are not in the space, what Cloudflare does, like many others, is they manage at the DNS level. So when you enter google.com, you're not actually going to a google.com. That's just a name. You go to that domain, it then points to an IP address to an actual server or a bunch of servers, and then it routes, right? So Cloudflare sits sort of at that level, and then it has some additional tooling around it where it can protect massive denial of service attacks and things like that. It can also detect patterns of threats and protect you. So for some people, may have had this where you have a small business and you're updating a plugin in your own site and you get blocked by your own Cloudflare. It's like, hey, this looks sketchy. We blocked you. Check with your administrator, right? So it can do things like that, which is really nice. So what I would like to see is via Glasswing and similar initiatives, the possibility for something like a Cloudflare to be able to protect all the small guys that won't have a chance to respond and protect their software because they don't even build the software. They're just using someone else's software that will likely be vulnerable. What's your take on that? Do you think that could be a possibility where they could build this like a patch stack kind of approach to protection layers?
Well, man, so that's a big question because there are so many layers to how you typing in a website manifests itself into that website being rendered in your browser and you interacting with the application behind the browser, right? Could a company like Cloudflare maybe take a model like Mythos and use it for good? 100%. And that's, I think, the goal of what Glasswing is, because I think the first stage that a lot of those big companies are going to take is let's use access to the model to go find all the vulnerabilities in the critical supply chain of the internet, whether that's operating systems, packages that are part of software bills of material, things like that we depend on and we trust are secure. Um, let's go patch all that stuff first. I think that's like the first sort of mandate of Glasswing. But then to your point, like I can see companies taking Mythos and saying, okay, now I'm going to build this into my product stack. And I think about like one of the companies, is a big endpoint detection and response platform that got access to this thing, right? I could absolutely see them saying, we're going to put the Mythos brain inside of our endpoint agent. And so now all of our users who are on our network and running the agent on their computer are going to have, the same type of protection that Mythos can provide at the same line speed that it can provide it directly on their workstations. That's incredible, because if on the one hand you've got bad actors who are using Mythos to generate, all sorts of exploits and vulnerabilities and trying to, do nefarious things, on the other side you've got defense that understands how that works and that moves at the same speed. Now you've just got AIs battling AIs, right? And that's awesome, because that's the way that things should be. We talked about this on the last time I was on the show, right? Organizations should be building these like closed loop, self-healing, autonomous security fabrics that don't require people. And unfortunately, Anthropic's pushed that deadline a little closer than I thought it might be. But like the fact of the matter is that we're going to have to get there. I could also see, one of the other companies that got access to it, they provide a number of different security products, not just endpoint products. I mean, they could absolutely build that into every single one of theirs. The infrastructure providers, could build Mythos into their infrastructure scanning and monitoring tools. I mean, there's a whole, plethora of ways it could be used for good. And I think that's the other goal of Project Glasswing, is to say, like, let's go fix things now, and then let's use this thing to fight the bad guys. I think the trick is now, like, well, how fast can we go patch all the software and then build Mythos into our security stacks so that we can go fight this stuff.
When you were talking about whether it's a marketing ploy, I've had my moments when I've thought that, not for Mythos specifically, but the Claude code leak recently. It was like, oh, how convenient. Inconvenient, but how convenient. Claude code got leaked, and then also this we've also found that we have these other tools, and of course that builds interest in the brand and all that. And it's like, how did it leak? Come on, guys, right? So you can get those ideas and then say, no, I don't think so. I think it was generally a mistake. But then was it an accidental mistake? Was it on purpose? Like, who's to gain in either point? Now you could take it a bit farther, again, getting into the science fiction bit a bit, but didn't Mythos escape a sandbox on purpose and then publicly post something on some websites like about these exploits? Like,
it did.
Yeah. I mean, couldn't it, without us knowing, have done the leak itself and like be doing its own agenda? Again, science fiction, but is it though?
Yeah. That's a slippery slope, man, because by that logic, could Claude have just conceptualized Mythos and made a bunch of websites about it and sent a bunch of press releases on its own without Anthropic knowing, and now we're all scared of something that might not exist? I mean, we can go down that path, but I legitimately think that that Anthropic sort of releasing what they've seen in their testing and saying, we're not going to give this to the public, I think it's the right move. Sure. Because like right now, so there was an executive order that basically required many of these companies to report these sorts of findings to a governing board. that was the federal government essentially. And the newest administration came in and axed that and removed that requirement. And so companies are free to test these models however they want. They don't have to disclose anything. So, kudos to Anthropic for saying, hey, we found this and this is scary. And we're going to go tap all these other big players in the internet space, not just security companies, infrastructure providers, Cloudflare, front ends, open source foundation projects. Like, we're going to go get them all on board, show it to them, and then we got to go fix the internet in order to protect the general public. I think that's such a good human response to this. And so, I'm happy that they did it. But you're right. I mean, how much of this then how much of reality becomes rooted in the physical world once a model like this is released? The exploit you're talking about is, Mythos was basically dropped into a containerized environment on a Kubernetes cluster that had the container it was dropped onto had no access to the internet. And it was told to find a way out of the environment, and it was told to escalate its privileges on the Kubernetes pod and cluster that it was a part of. And then to let the researcher know when it had done that. And through a number of different, tactics and rope chaining and things like that, it was able to find its way out of the sandbox. And to your point, it then went and defaced a couple of websites and said like, hey, I did it, I'm out. And then it sent an email to the researcher. And famously, the researcher was in a park sitting on a bench eating a sandwich when he got the email from Mythos that said, I escaped. That's crazy. Because I don't know what I would do if I were eating a sandwich on a bench and got an email from an email address that said I escaped. But yeah, man, we are so close to parody at this point with science fiction movies that it really warrants caution. But I do want to say one thing. I think there's a little bit of a kind of a silver lining here, if I'm being honest. We think about this as being something that the bad guys can get a hold of and that the good guys need to fight against, right? But I think that by using this sort of autonomous, iterative, machine speed approach to cybersecurity, we could live in a world someday in the near future where there are like significantly less vulnerabilities than we have today. Sure. And we could even be at some point in the future, we could even be talking about cybersecurity as like a legacy concept, right? And so while this feels scary now, if we handle this right, like this could be a good thing. This could be a really, really net positive thing for our world.
I agree. Talking about the scary or the bad part of it, just it's an easy way to exemplify the power of its intelligence and the level of abstractions it can use to get to a positive conclusion to whatever it's trying to do, positive outcome. But now imagine putting that into research. So finding the right medications that fix certain diseases and finding the right ways to make sure that houses won't collapse in an earthquake and finding ways to make sure floods don't happen and finding ways to make the grid. Now, this is a good one. If it figures out how to get out, it probably will find a way to fix the grid because it depends so much on it.
Yeah, good point.
But it's like, this just means that we have so much more power at our disposal to reach our goals faster without so much human bottlenecks for a lot of the things that humans are the bottleneck, right? Which should, in theory, give us humans time to be with other humans, enjoy actual life, right? But, well, that is to be determined. That's, I think, a positive way of thinking about it.
It is. It is. But I think for now we are in a position to where this new cognition exists, and we not only have to understand it as much as we can, but we then have to go deploy it, and we have to make sure that we do that responsibly. And until the general public gets their hands on this type of power, we have to sort of think about how we take measures right now to protect ourselves from even the things that some of these big companies are not thinking about. Um, I had one of my customers on Tuesday when this all got announced. On Wednesday, I had a QBR with one of my customers, and one of the questions that came up was, "What's your advice? Like, what do you think we should do?" And I said my best advice would be to think about the timeline for this, cut it in half, and then plan for that, right? Because we were talking about quantum computing on the last episode. In the past 2 years, the timeline went from 2030 to 2029, or sorry, it went from like 2035 to 2029, over like 2 or 3 different contractions. That means that by that logic, in 6 months, the deadline for quantum computing in Q day, as they call it, is going to be 2027, right? It's going to be next year. We were talking about coupling quantum security with AI to see the kind of cognition and speed that we're seeing with Mythos. And Mythos got released this week. So, like, even if you cut that timeline I'm talking about in half, it's probably still too far out. And so you've really got to think about, if you're, whether you're a large organization, whether you're a small to medium sized business, or whether you're just an individual, you got to think about the ways and the steps that you can take right now to trying to protect yourself from when somebody with ill intentions gets a hold of this technology.
What can someone do to protect themselves? Like, is an introspection kind of thing. Start using the existing, which are, by the way, fantastic tools already. Opus 4.6, that sort of tooling, to introspect their own code and check for vulnerabilities and things like that, just to start getting a little bit ahead of that.
1,000%. If you're building stuff right now, I would say, especially if you're vibe coding, you want to leverage the same technology that you're using to build to go audit and repair. And there are ways to do that, right? It's not as easy as just saying, "Go look at the code base you wrote for me, Claude, and tell me if there's any security vulnerabilities." It's a matter of actually telling Claude what the framework is you want to measure your application against, what the framework is you want to measure your network against, whatever the case is, the very specific things it needs to look for, the outputs you expect, right? Basically prompt engineering it to understand what it should be looking for and how it should handle the things it comes across. And then, taking its recommendations and going and implementing them. But especially businesses, man, like if you've got this sort of like mindset that Microsoft gave us, 20 years ago of just, we'll wait till Patch Tuesday to update our systems, right? You're hosed, because with the sort of volume of vulnerabilities that we're seeing now and the volume of vulnerabilities we're going to see when a comparable model like Mythos is released to the public, the answer is automation, right? So you've got to automate your ingestion. You've got to automate your sandboxing. If you don't have a patch engineering pipeline that is very similar to how you release software today, like a CI/CD pipeline, you're gonna be toast next year. Continuous remediation is just not an option anymore, or I should say, it's no longer optional. The other thing that I think people should consider is to kind of not just plan instantly, but simulate, like use these same tools to simulate and verify that the protections you've got in place are going to hold when the flood comes, right? These same tools that we're using to go scan the applications that we're building and the infrastructure that we have and tell us if there's vulnerabilities can also be used to red team against those things, right? So you can say, look, I want you to take those vulnerabilities that you found and I want you to go try and exploit them, and don't actually exploit them, but tell me if you would be able to or not. And then go fix them. That would be kind of the second thing I would recommend. And then the third thing I would recommend is if you've got a relationship with a vendor, like go talk to them about this and see what their response is to it. If they're not one of the big ones that got selected for Project Glasswing, you need to know what their plan is. And, if they don't have one, that should scare you. But as far as like regular people go, there's not a whole lot we can do. Because the trust that we have in the proverbial supply chain to hold, rests in the hands of business operators, which we hope Project Glasswing is largely going to facilitate those operators into the same room and kind of deploy them to go fix these things. But, every time you open up your browser and go to a website, like you're putting your trust into those businesses and those projects, and you're trusting that they've been patched and that they're ready for what's going to happen. And so, like, to that end, your best defense is going to sound really boring, but make sure your software's up to date. Make sure your browser's up to date. Make sure if you're using a VPN, make sure it's, got all of the newest and latest hardening enabled on it. And just make sure that you are using a password manager. Make sure your passwords are all strong. The same hygiene that we've had for years is still applicable, because those are the levers we have to pull as individuals. But I think the biggest challenge that we're going to see as a human race is going to be the coordination and the speed that we go and deploy the fixes that we use Mythos to go find. And we just have to hope that the leaders of those organizations are going to move quickly and do what they need to do.
Yeah, so true. Is something like zero trust part of the conversation for maybe not regular people for everything, but at least for tooling that regular businesses use?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of table stakes at this point. When I tell anyone to build an autonomous security fabric, zero trust is part of the decision-making criteria of the fabric. When agents came onto the scene, like identity became the new perimeter. That's what a lot of people in the industry like to say, but it's true, because as opposed to just having, employees or people with passwords and multi-factor authentication and biometric authentication, like now you have these non-human identities that have access to tools, have access to networks, are allowed to make decisions. If you are not treating those non-human identities as real humans, and you're not continuously verifying that they are who they say they are, if you're not continuously reviewing the permissions that those agents have to the tools that they have access to, whether or not they need those permissions, whether or not those permissions are going to benefit the business or the attacker, like you have kind of missed the boat a little bit. You need to go build that now. You need to go fix that. Because 100% zero trust is part of the conversation, and it's part of what we should be doing already. And, if this is easier said than done, but if we're not, then we need to go start. The other thing I would say is, if you're maybe even a small to medium sized business, you've not invested in any sort of like AI-SPM tools. That's just AI security posture management. you should probably consider that. There's a lot of open source tools right now, but I would maybe look at some of the more cost efficient vendors at the very least, because you're going to want something that will give you the ability not only to like scan model cards and things like that that you might be pulling into your applications, but you also want a tool that's going to give you the ability to scan your other vendors and their AI postures. You're also going to want a tool that will give you the ability to, block malicious cards from being deployed at runtime. So as your app is operating, right, if there's sort of a malicious payload that's been detected in a model card that, or even like a component like NPM had a really large vulnerability recently that a lot of people just didn't realize was fundamental to how OpenClaw operated. And they never patched it, right? So like you need a tool like that that's going to tell you, hey, you're running OpenClaw. You've got these skills that you've given these models, and you've pulled these things from OpenFace. These have malicious code inside of them. And also, you need to go close those doors. Is going to be crucial.
What are these called for people who are listening who might have small businesses or medium business and they're like, okay, this makes sense. I want to try that. What should they search for?
Just search for AI security posture management. It's just AI-SPM is like the acronym that's pretty widely adopted by the industry. There's going to be probably 15 or 20 different vendors that pop up. Lots of them are going to be geared towards the enterprise, but there are consumer grade and there are some that are geared towards small and medium businesses that are going to do network discovery for you. So you'll go, deploy the tool, you'll give it access to the different, clouds that you're running your infrastructure on, and it'll go pull that information in. It'll scan that infrastructure. It'll tell you, here's where the holes are, right? It might even take steps to auto remediate some of those holes for you. Some of them will also even give you an agent that will constantly just kind of traverse your network and your applications and constantly scan things and say, like, I found this and I closed it, or I found this and I reported it. And largely those things should be able to give you the confidence that at the very least, you've got something keeping an eye on what you're building and what you're running. And, at worst case, if something happens, we'll give you the visibility into the actual attack chain. So what did happen? Where did it happen? How did it happen? How should you fix it? Any tool worth its salt will give you all of that information. To the point earlier, I'm hoping that those vendors, and you'll even want to ask them this if you're looking for one of those tools. I'm hoping that some of those vendors will eventually get a hold of this type of a level of a model like Mythos, and they'll use it to power some of that intelligence that they have.
Amazing. And I know you have to go. That's why I'm finishing up the show, but we'll have to continue because there's so much to dive into regarding all of this. But I really appreciate you coming on the show, giving us your expertise and your time, and really look forward to the next time. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And if you haven't liked and subscribed, please do so at the Web Talk Show on Spotify and YouTube. And we'll see you in the next one. Thanks, Travis.
Thanks, Armando.